Before we kick it off, I want to put in a plug for our next webinar, which will be August 25th at 2 p.m. Pacific. That's titled Challenges and Opportunities with Shrub Restoration in the Great Basin, Climate Adaptation and Planting Techniques by Dr. Matt Germino of the USGS. Today's webinar title is Cheatgrass Die-offs as an Opportunity for Restoration by Owen Baughman from the University of Nevada, Reno. And Owen, I'm going to just skip the little bio here. Suffice to say that he did his undergraduate at Natural Resources Ecology at University of Idaho and his master's at the University of Reno, and this is some work that he's been doing for the last few years. So Owen, here's the...
All right, thank you.
You should just roll on forward.
Everybody hear me well? All right. Yes, my name is Owen Baughman. I'm presenting this research along with co-authors on this, my advisor Elizabeth Ledger, who's a professor at the University of Nevada, Reno, and Susan Meyer, who's helped with this research for a long time. She's kind of the matriarch of this cheatgrass die-off issue. And Peter Weisberg and Tom Diltz, also at UNR, contributed here to the end of this with some really exciting stuff. Before I get rolling, I'd like to point out that we were supported by Great Basin LCC with this work, in addition to the Bureau of Land Management and NDOW put in some money on this too. So before I get into the details, I'm just going to give a quick roadmap here. I'm going to talk about what is a die-off. I think most people are familiar, but I want to make sure that that's clear. And then I'm going to talk about why you would think about restoring die-offs. And I'll talk about the two studies that we've done. The first was a precision seeding study, a little smaller scale, and then the ongoing study, which is a drill seeding study, that followed up with that first one. And then I'll talk a bit about the idea of being able to remotely sense die-offs to sort of bolster this idea. And then I'll talk about what the implications of this work are, at least in our eyes. So what is a cheatgrass die-off? It is a stand replacement failure. So it's pretty much a cheatgrass monoculture that fails to replace itself. And you can see in both of these images, the top image, the green is healthy cheatgrass, and in the bottom, the brown is healthy cheatgrass that grew and produced seeds. And then you can step across it into an area that's full of this gray dead litter from a previous year's crop of cheatgrass that did not produce a crop for the whole year. And I'm not going to get into what caused these die-offs, although it's very fascinating. Susan Meyer's been doing a lot of work with that recently, but we think it's some soil pathogens, maybe one or a couple working together. But and we know that these die-offs aren't like typical die-offs that you see on the landscape that are a cause of drought, because we have these areas that we call controls, which is this healthy cheatgrass monoculture right next to the die-off, and it's on a scale that we know isn't caused by differential precipitation. And some of our experiments have showed that, as you might expect with this sort of natural fallowing, so this landscape doesn't really produce plants for, or this, these areas don't produce plants for a year, and that kind of allows resources to accumulate. And some of our studies have shown that there's a lot more nitrogen in these areas that didn't produce plants, and also the soil is generally a little wetter for most of the season. So 2014 especially, and this year too, were great years for die-offs, and it kind of helped remind us that these things are not a rare phenomenon that occur on small areas. They are frequent, and they occur on pretty large areas. And here's a picture from just a few weeks ago, this front one, of an area in Buena Vista Valley that's very complete die-off that happened within some shrubs, and you'll see that sometimes. And then this back imagery is just from Google Earth from Buena Vista Valley, and it shows kind of a larger scale of these patches of die-off. And these, again, just remind us that this is something worth noticing, paying attention to. So why would you want to restore an area that is totally infested with cheatgrass and will likely become infested with cheatgrass again? Well, from this image here, you can see in the front of in the foreground, there are some native plants that are doing really well. There's a perennial bunch grasses, despite the fact that everything around them died off. Now, of course, those were probably established before the die-off happened, but it made us wonder what kind of opportunities there are. And so in this absence of cheatgrass growth in a former monoculture, these native species are likely available to get more resources and there's less competition during that year. But again, there may be some potential for negative effects because whatever wiped out the cheatgrass seeds and kept them from germinating and growing could also affect the natives. So we wanted to look at these questions. So our first study, we just asked, can we establish native species in a die-off? If we put them in, will they even come up? And the second was, like, you do one experiment, you might as well do two. We wanted to compare local seeds and non-local seeds of the same species to see if there's differences in establishment between those. So I'm going to talk about that study first. But the second study, which a bit of a teaser, native species did establish in a die-off. So our second study was to try to use more species and common seeding methods to see if we would get the same results. So, and then we also wanted to see if doubling the seed rate would show an increase in establishment, because that's something that's often used to try to increase establishment. So we wanted to compare that. The study locations for these three experiments were located around the Winnemucca area. And the first study is in red there. We only had one site, and that was not because we wanted to do a pseudo-replicated science study. We actually could only find one die-off that year, and we had to just do it at one site. But it taught us a lot, and in the second study, we did this at 3 sites. And the first study we initiated in 2012 was when we planted it, and the second study we planted this last fall. I'll talk about the precision seeding study here first. It's south of Winnemucca. It's in a formerly Wyoming sage-dominated area that has no sagebrush left anymore, but is dominated mostly by cheatgrass and some other weeds. It's in a 9-inch precip zone, and it's had a history of die-off activity since 2008 when I started tooling around out here looking at die-offs. So it's a spot that's experienced it once or twice before. What we did here seems kind of crazy, but we glued seeds, 6,400 seeds, to bamboo skewer toothpicks. And this seems crazy, but the reason we do this is because if you're trying to do a focused study and you're planting grass seeds into a grassland, it's hard to see which ones are yours when they're coming up. And as you can see in the second image here, you can tell which plant is ours because it's coming right up along the stem of the toothpick. And so this allows us not only to get our seeds at exactly the right depth, and we can control that with the toothpicks, it facilitates our ability to detect these seeds every single month and see how they're growing and see where they're coming up and where they're not. So it's a very great tool for research. And we planted this in 2012, and every month during the active season for 2 growing seasons, we went out and saw how many were showing any greenness anywhere, which we call activity. So it's because it's hard to tell if a plant has died or it's just a nest, so we just call it activity. And then May of both years, which is kind of the end of the growing season for these small seedlings, we measured their vigor, which is how green they were, and then we measured some growth characteristics, how tall they were, and how many leaves they had. And you can see looking for these cheatgrass plants is very exciting, or these natives in the cheatgrass sea is it's backbreaking in a different kind of way. The species we used for this were Poa secunda, or Sandberg's bluegrass, and Elamis elamoides, or squirreltail. And we used these two because they were present near the site, which means that we could get local collections, which we made ourselves. But they're also widely distributed species that are commonly used in restoration when you're reaching for native seeds. And there's been some evidence over the past few years that they can be competitive with cheatgrass. So they're pretty good restoration species as far as native bunch grasses go. And for both of these, we made a local collection within a mile or 2 of the site. And then we chose the most closely environmentally matched cultivar or accession or selection that's commercially available, which even though we were trying to contrast local versus commercial, we wanted to choose wisely among the commercial seeds available. And for Sandbergs, this was Mountain Home, and for Squirreltail, it was Toe Jam Creek, and the locations are there. So I'm going to get into the results here. I just want to remind you of the question, can native species establish in these die-offs? And I'll point out quickly, too, that these 2 images are lined up as if it was one image, and die-offs usually recolonize from the leftover cheatgrass seeds after 1 year of being a die-off. And so this is what happened at our site. And so all the results I'm showing you for both of these studies are the results that we see despite the fact that cheatgrass is redominating the site during the year of our experiment. So we're relying on that fallowed year to have accumulated some resources or whatever's going on there. But this isn't growing cheatgrass or growing natives in an area that still lacks cheatgrass. Before I talk about this figure here, I just want to let everybody know what's going on. On the left side is just active growth. So again, the proportion of the viable seeds that we planted that are showing active or green growth. So you can think of it as a percent, 20%, 40%, 60% of our seeds are growing. And then along the bottom was just how often we went and checked them. And for this first figure, Poa secunda is the circles, Elnus elamoides is the triangles, and the die-off are the white symbols, and the control is the dark. So we're just going to look at the beginning of the first season first. So we did see that the die-offs let native plants grow. You can see that right after we planted, we have a lot of native emergence, but we see less emergence in the die-off, which is again those lighter colored bars, than the control, which is the darker. For whatever reason, we had fewer emerging in the early part of the first season. However, for both species, between April and May, this trend switched very clearly, and we start seeing either no difference between the die-off or the control, or more commonly, we see more seedlings in the die-off than the control at the end of the first season, as well as through most of the second season. And I'll blow up this this final graph. We have pretty abysmal survival, I'll admit, but you can see that going into the end of the second season, the die-off is showing more active plants than the control for both species. And as I said, in May, we measured vigor and some growth. And I'll talk about the vigor on the left here first. The top two graphs are the Poa secunda, and the bottom two graphs are Elnus elamoides, with the first column being the first season and the second column being the second season. The vigor data show a very clear trend of the die-offs, which are the dark bars, having very much more vigor than the controls. And so these plants were staying longer. They're staying active longer into the season. And if we look at the growth data, which I tried to reduce graphs by just making cartoons here. So these asterisks indicate significance. In the die-off, which is the right edge of each graph, our plants were either leafier, which is this figure here, taller, or leafier and taller. So we have longer plants that are active longer, and they're healthier in the die-off, and there's more of them for both species. Oof. So to get back to the second aspect of this first study, comparing local and non-local materials, here you can see an array of what this looks like when seedlings are starting to grow in our toothpicks. Similar graph here, Poa secunda is diamonds this time, and Elnus elamoides are the squares, with local being white and non-local being dark. We did see differences between seed sources. In the first season, however, we saw both things happening. For Poa secunda, which are on the bottom here generally, we saw the local outperforming the non-local in terms of how many plants were growing. However, for Elnus elamoides, we see a pattern that emerges more towards the end of the first season, that the non-locals are doing better than the local. Looking at the second year data, however, this the local advantage seems to be the only one that persists, notably in the Poa secunda. Squirrel tail has pretty low survival, but there's usually no difference. But again, looking at the very end of this, where survival is low, blown this up a little for you, and the locals are starting to show that they are going to be more prevalent than the non-locals. So it's kind of a mixed story we got from here, but it definitely matters for POA, at least in this site in this year. So Again, we measured vigor and growth, and we see similar trends as the previous data set. Again, Poa-secunda on the top here shows, the vigor shows that the local, which is the hashed one, is doing better, whereas Elamis elamoides shows a non-local advantage in the first season, and the second season, really nothing going on difference-wise. And we didn't see as many significant trends in the leafiness and height, but in both species at different times, the non-locals were taller and occasionally leafier, which isn't surprising because these commercial plants are often selected because they're larger and leafier. So, looking at the first study, can native species establish into die-offs? Yes, they can. And they are healthier as well. And do local seeds establish better than non-local? We got a mixed answer there. It can matter for some species, and others the other species was a little unclear. But again, it was a 2-year study. So moving on to the second study, which is a lot more exciting here. Will we see these results using more species and common seeding methods? And does doubling the seed rate increase our establishment? Point these sites out again. They're kind of around Winnemucca in Wyoming sage, and this site here in Grass Valley was kind of on the edge of a salt desert scrubs community. But again, they're all totally dominated by mostly cheatgrass and some other mustards and Russian thistle later in the summer. They're in 9 to 10 inch precip zones. This northern side is our wettest, and this Grass Valley site on the right side and the bottom is the driest. And what we did is we made half-acre fences around a plot in each the die-off and the control, but these two plots were not more than a few hundred meters from each other. And we drill seeded both the die-off and the control. I don't want you to think that the control was not seeded. We did want to see how seeding a die-off compares to doing it in a control. And we drill seeded with 7 species using a Truex no-till drill at 44 and at 88 pure live seeds per foot square. The species we used, well, we seeded this in November of 2014, and we just checked this in the spring for density only. We just went out and counted how many plants were coming up, because our other experiment showed, and lots of people have learned this in the Great Basin, that trying to figure out what's happening with 1 year of data is pretty difficult. So in spring of 2016, we're going to go out and do a little more data collection. We're going to count and we're going to measure plants. These are the 7 species we used, the same 2 grasses, Sandberg's bluegrass and squirreltail, although we have different cultivars and selections this time. We used 2 species of shrubs, spiny hopsage and 4-winged saltbrush, and then we used 3 forbs, western yarrow, royal penstemon, and desert globe mallow. And the 2 that are highlighted in green here are the ones we were able to obtain local collections for. There was a squirreltail that had been collected the previous year for potential grow out, and the hopsage was collected in this same region of Nevada. And before I start to the results, I want to talk about how this project was really, each of us chipped in 25 cents and we got $1 out of it sort of project. And what we did was us at UNR, with our funding from the GBLCC and BLM, designed the study, did some organization, and put logistics together as far as the study was concerned. And we're going to collect data, monitor, analyze it. And we were able to build the fences as well and buy some specialty seeds that the BLM probably couldn't purchase. But the BLM Winnemucca, with great help from Rob Burton and Mark Williams and Gene Seedlitz, they helped get the CXs moving and got our actions all approved on time. And they were able to provide the drill seeder, as you can see in this image, which is the drill seeder is quite small, but you have to drag the tractor, and then you got to get a bigger tractor to drive the tractor. So they helped with all that, which was excellent, and provided all of the fence materials from a reclaimed pile they have that are pulled off of old fires and things. So it was really small investments from both ends ended up making a pretty large project here. So, and they provided some seeds as well. I'll show you some pictures of the sites here. This is the Buena Vista Valley site as we were seeding it in November, and pretty moonscape, not a lot of cheatgrass litter on the site. This is the die-off, of course, and it's a pretty clean slate to plant in. This is it after, this is the same area after weeds started to grow, and as I said, these weeds do come back into the areas, but as you'll see in our data, the natives are there and they're doing pretty well. But this is kind of what recolonization looks like out there this spring. And here's an image from a little earlier that year. You can see in the furrow here lots of the little, very spindly native grasses coming up with lots of weeds on both sides. This is the Four Corners site. This is our driest site. And again, very, very low litter and pretty stark environment. But this site is one of the best ones that's performed for us. You can see some weeds in between the drill rows here that are coming up, but the things in the drill rows are all our perennial bunch grasses. The squirrel tail and the bluegrass are coming up, and we just checked a few weeks ago, and they're brown now, but they're 3 or 4 inches tall, so they did really well. It kind of looks like an old wheat field. And that's the die-off. The control, because it's had this constant cheatgrass pressure, we don't see as large of plants, but we've got just a lot more cheatgrass, and it's farther along too because it's all competing with itself. The Paradise site was our wettest site, but also when we were seeding it, all of the weeds had an early advantage, and you can see here they're already growing before we even seeded our natives. So we were interested to see how that would affect things. And this is it after, or this is it in the spring of the first year. Again, doesn't look like we did anything. You could hardly find the drill rows, but I will show you our data, and it's pretty exciting. And again, the control always seems a little farther ahead in terms of how brown the cheatgrass is. These are taken on the same day, but there's just a lot more plants here, and so they're kind of competing with each other and going to seed a lot sooner than over here. All right, can we use more species and a drill seeder to get these results? Our graph here is a lot simpler this time. This is just plants per square meter in the spring when we counted of the first season. And our 3 sites are down here, and the 1x is the single rate, and the 2x is the double rate. So we have more seedlings in the die-off than the control after drill seeding, a lot. The average across all these sites and all these rates is 300%. So 3 times as many plants growing in this first year in these areas, regardless of what site and seeding rate. So this is pretty exciting. The die-off bars are dark here. And these were all pretty large differences. But I got to point out again, these are first-year results. They're very exciting, and but these bars will be a little lower for everything in the second year after attrition. For the doubling experiment, the doubling rate did increase seedlings, but only at 2 sites, which I've highlighted here with this extra box. And these 2 sites, you can compare them visually. This first site was, it more than doubled our number of plants by doubling the rate, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So there may have been some influence of having driven the seeder twice over the area with the double disc action, could have compacted the soil better for the plants or made more microsites for the seeds. So we're not sure exactly what happened there. And then at Paradise, it didn't quite double it on average, but it did improve them at these 2 sites, but not at this Four Corners site. And I'm showing you grass here. I forgot to mention that. This is both grasses pooled together. We had no shrubs come up, and I only found 1 yarrow plant in all of our monitoring. But this is April is when we looked, and that's admittedly very early. April of the first season, pretty early to see shrubs are formed. So we're going to wait for the second season before we say that nothing came up. But even that might be too soon with some of these shrubs. So we were able to replicate this with our drill seeding quite well, actually, with 3 times as many grasses coming up in our die-offs than our control areas. And the doubling the seed rate sometimes increased establishment, but it wasn't unanimous across our area. So before I summarize things, I want to talk about some really exciting and quite recent breakthroughs that have happened in the small world of die-off remote sensing. And the next few slides were donated by Peter Weisberg and Tom Diltz at UNR. And so this is just a Google Earth image, and you can see this gray area here. This is a die-off. I'd been on the ground days before I went back to my computer and saw this, and I was like, wow, we can be able to model that. And they've been trying to model this, and they have succeeded. And here's a model, a spatial model that just predicts based on imagery where these die-offs are. And I'm going to scroll back and forth here again. You can see how accurate that is for this region anyway. So they moved forward with some field verifications this summer, and this map here is a map of the 2015 predicted die-offs based on Landsat imagery for the Winnemucca area. Everything in red is what's predicted to be a die-off. And just a couple weeks ago, Peter went out to look at these areas, and 94% of the areas that they went to that were predicted as die-offs were actually die-offs. So this is really exciting, and this is using Landsat data, which goes back to 1980s. So we can start to do some large studies here once the model is dialed in. And here's a couple pictures of, again, die-off that's happening in a shrub area. As long as there's a big enough area among the shrubs, this model can pick it up. But this model not only picks up these areas that anyone would notice as a die-off if they drove around in the summer, but this is just a few weeks ago, and if you drove by this, you wouldn't really see that gray die-off litter that signals you to think it's a die-off. This is all Russian thistle coming back in. But the model predicted this as a die-off because it used some spring imagery that happened before the Russian thistle came in. And this invasion of the die-off by other weeds is kind of common. And so it's great that this model can pick that up before that happens. And here's kind of the most exciting part of this is a summary map from the last 30 years of Landsat data showing just a snapshot of northern Nevada here with colors indicating how many times these die-offs have been predicted to happen based on this fairly accurate model. With the lighter colors, more orange being 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times with this kind of bluish purple here. And just looking at this, you can see how much area has potentially experienced these die-offs. And again, this is a model, but we have reason to believe it's fairly good. And lots of areas, especially Grass Valley here and north of Winnemucca, have experienced die-offs 4 or more times in the last 30 years. So this is something that happens on a large area when you add it all up, and it happens fairly frequent. So to summarize all of this, die-offs promoted native success. We found more native plants coming up in these die-offs than in the adjacent monoculture that did not experience the die-off. And we found this over 4 sites during 4 years of experimentation. And these die-offs promote higher native vigor and growth in our first study, and we haven't gotten to that point on the second study, but just visually things were looking pretty good. So I hope everybody will stay tuned for results next year of this. And using local seeds and or increasing the rate can improve seedling success, or the success of your seedlings, I should say. So, and then also these die-offs are common and remotely detectable. So that's just a great tool we can add on to this idea that we can restore these areas. The implications of this are that die-offs can improve restoration success in these highly invaded areas where people have often struggled to get anything to work. And again, we're only getting a few natives in, and the cheatgrass is coming back, but we are getting a few natives in, and that's and we're getting in more than a lot of other efforts are. So they can be detected. These die-offs can be detected in time for same-year seeding. You can figure out where they are by field studies or potentially with this model early in the summer. And that gives you plenty of time to sort of put some resources together to get out there and put some seeds on the ground. And on the larger picture, they offer recurring and large-scale restoration opportunities in these challenging areas. And so I've had to bubble up 2 take-home messages here, and they might seem sort of shocking, or at least interestingly worded. You can think of die-offs as being cheaper than herbicide application and less of a crisis than a wildfire. But just like herbicide application and wildfire, it's ways that you can go into these cheatgrass-dominated areas and slightly improve your abilities to get a leg up on cheatgrass. You know, herbicide gets rid of it, wildfire can get rid of it, some of it, and these die-offs can too. And it's cheaper than herbicides, and it happens a little earlier than a wildfire does, so you have a little more head time. And just in general, I've heard some people saying we should walk away from cheatgrass and near monocultures because it's just too much of an uphill battle. And while it is an uphill battle, I think there's some tools that we are discovering and we can still discover to help these areas along and not just walk away from them. So with that, I'll flash up some acknowledgments here. These 3 people, no, actually a lot of people. I won't read through them all, but our funding sources here, we're grateful for them for sending some money our way to work on this, and hordes of volunteers and technicians counting things. BLM really helped us out with both studies, and we have support from other places as well, Endow and BYU. So with that, I would we'll take some questions.
Well, thanks, Owen. That's really fascinating work. Liz, do we have any questions from the chat board?
Yeah, we've got 5 questions here, and so I'll just start from the top. The first one is, how do the seedling rates convert to pounds per acre?
Oh, I would have to get back to you on that one. I've got that in a spreadsheet somewhere, but I am not super savvy at comparing these. And some of these seeds are really weird and fluffy and large. So if whoever wants to know that information can contact me at my email address there, I'd be happy to share some of these things. I will say that we didn't cook up a very precise recipe. We just sort of looked at what's been seeded in areas with these species that we used and kind of used those as a guideline. So, but I'd be happy to get that information to people.
Thanks. Next question.
There was also a question about any idea what causes the die-offs originally?
Yeah, that's the big question. We are fairly certain it's some kind of soil organism, which sounds like a cop-out, but we've done lots of experiments and we've cleared a few organisms from the suspect table, and we've got many more that we haven't said yes or no on. The world of soil ecology is very, very complex, but it's some sort of organism that's attacking seeds that have already started germinating, but that aren't very big yet, because it does leave the seeds that are carrying over, the seeds that won't germinate for a following year, it leaves those intact, and that's why cheatgrass can come back to a site. But sorry, I can't answer that question. But Susan Meyer has been really focusing on this, and I think she had a presentation recently that may be online of her latest results with some of these experiments. So,
thanks.
And the next question was, why did you not include Wyoming sagebrush?
We didn't include that because of the, we didn't like really sit down and say we're not going to use sagebrush, but from a seeding perspective, it's a pretty low success rate, and in a 1 or 2 year study, you might not be able to pick up those differences, but that can be true for the other shrubs that we use. So I wouldn't say that it was strategic of us not to use it, but we wanted to use some of these lesser known shrubs in terms of restoration too, to see if we could learn something there.
Thanks, Owen. We have a few folks here in the room. Are there any questions from the folks in the room?
I have a question. So earlier in the presentation, you mentioned nitrogen was higher on the site where there's a die-off. And I was wondering, well, there's a couple questions. One is, you know, you're identifying pathogens on the control versus pathogens on the die-off. And I'm wondering if the chemistry of the soil, if you're, every time you're looking at a die-off, if you're getting a feel for the nitrogen content, and if that could be something that is suppressing, or if you're looking at that.
Right. That's a great question. And when we do these experiments, we always try to, you know, if you're looking at pathogens, you have to look for everything that's in the control areas and compare that with everything that's in the die-off, and it's very messy. But it's hard to know if these areas had higher nitrogen before they died off, and that could be playing into this. And unfortunately, you can't, or we haven't been able to take samples somewhere before it died off and see what that looks like, to my knowledge. But there is a bit of an idea. The latest idea is that something affects the cheatgrass. Some organism affects cheatgrass and makes it so it doesn't produce seed, and so all the nutrients usually go into the seed. And so when all of this cheatgrass litter that didn't produce seed hits the ground, it's a lot more nutrient rich than the litter would have been, and so that can prime the soil and give these organisms that are in the soil more resources, and from that they step off to attacking the cheatgrass seed. So that's the latest idea, which is playing into this idea that these areas have different nutrients than beforehand.
Right, and I'm wondering though, because the cheatgrass, the die-off, is just a one-year scenario, if there's pathogens in the soil, why they don't continue to suppress year after year.
Yeah.
You know, so one is there's a variation between the control right next door and then, you know, where there's a die-off. So that would be something to key in terms of the nitrogen, just because somebody had indicated to me at one time that if you put enough nitrogen on the soil, it will suppress cheatgrass. I think it was when I was with NRCS that they had talked about that. So you might want to look at just measuring the chemistry of the soil to see if there's something else going on,
right,
influencing, you know.
Yeah. We have taken these samples, and we know that the nitrogen, at least from any literature we found, is nowhere near like a fatal level to the seeds. Because that was one of our early things. Like, wow, there's a lot of nitrogen. Is that too much?
Yeah.
It's not too much for them to. It's not fatal by any means. But yeah, there's a lot of angles to go with what's causing it. But I've always been interested in, like, what can we do with this? You know, before we even know what's causing these die-offs, we can do something with them. So they're great. Yeah.
Liz, do you have another question there? We have another person here waiting, but I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I've got two questions here. The first one is, when did you conduct these seedings?
We conducted both the seedings we did in November. I think it was right before Thanksgiving of last year, the drill seedings. And the previous study we planted also in November, I think. And we tried to plant as early as we could so that they could get a head start on the weeds, but not too early that they'd be triggered into growing by fall storms that weren't going to sustain them. So. Okay,
and then the second question is, in the control for the second experiment, did you run the seeder over the control site? They mentioned it looked like it in some of the photos.
Yes, yeah, we definitely seeded both the control and the die-off. We did have a strip in both the die-off and the control that was unseeded that we are monitoring, but I didn't talk about that. But no, we ran the drill seeder in both areas so that we could compare how these die-offs allow seeds to grow better, because when you run a drill seeder through a cheatgrass monoculture, that's a pretty hostile environment for a native seed. But they did, I mean, you can look back at those figures. We do have plants growing and surviving in these areas that didn't even die off.
I was interested in the model that you all developed, and my question is, what time of the year did you use the Landsat imagery to make the determination where these die-offs were?
Yeah, the question was about the remote sensing model and what time of year the imagery was from. This particular model is sort of their newer stab at this, and they're, instead of trying to sense, their previous approach had been trying to figure out where cheatgrass grows and how they can sense where cheatgrass is, and then comparing one year to the next and seeing where cheatgrass has vanished for the year. but modeling cheatgrass is very difficult. And this model just keys in on that gray color of the die-off, and that's all you need. You need 1 year's sample of, of imagery, and that imagery is generally in the spring. I think you could run it in the summer, but the spring is when things that are alive are generally green, and so these areas that are gray really stand out. And so I don't know if their model was used like March or April, but it's somewhere in the springtime, and you could contact Peter Weisberg about that. But it just keys in on that gray kind of moonscape and says, like, this is a die-off. And then they screen out some agricultural stuff, and they screen out playas and other things that are going to be gray all year round. So
they used NDVI to do that work, so the relative greenness type of imagery from Landsat, is that what they were using?
Yeah, I'm not sure on the specifics. I don't know. Yeah, you'd have to talk to Peter or Tom. They've been working with that for a long time, but yeah, it's a simpler approach than they had been taking, and I don't even know if it uses the NDVI or not. But
Liz, any more from the web?
No, none currently.
I have a question.
Oh, okay. We do have one more here.
I was wondering if you are aware of similar kinds of die-offs with like Bromish rubens, same kinds of things happening with that species in the lower deserts, or?
I've never heard of that, but yeah, I wouldn't. Yeah, I haven't heard of that, but is that something that people have seen, or?
No.
Okay.
I'm aware of drought-related
right.
diebacks, but you're talking about just a complete die-off like this.
Right.
I haven't heard reports of that yet, at least, but something I've worked down in the Mojave, and that's any of this stuff that's applicable down there is
right.
Of interest.
Yeah, usually when you're looking for evidence of die-offs, most people are referring to, like you say, drought-related die-offs. So as far as we know, we haven't seen something similar to this in the Great Basin with any other species, or even in the Mojave, but it's hard to say.
But Owen is moving to Flagstaff, so if somebody does want to have him survey, I'll put in a plug for him.
I won't bring any cheatgrass with me, I promise.
So, Liz, I think we're out of questions.
Yep, there are no new questions unless anyone in the audience has one that they'd like to type in to the question box.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I want to take this minute to remind you that we have a very short survey at the end of this you'll be getting by email when you registered, and we'd really appreciate it. We'd like to evaluate what you think of the webinar series, the speakers, and the content, and it helps us provide better and better webinars as we go forward. Owen, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. That's some of the best good news I've heard about cheatgrass in a long time. Thank you very much.
Thanks for putting some funding our way, and thanks for everybody for attending the webinar as well.
Thank you, everybody.